Hello and welcome to stories read and written by Ballerscheff. If you'd like to read along to the stories that I read here, you can find a link to my blog in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. This is On the Sidelines. Fixing her eyes on the sea and the gentle rocking of the water made her feel calm and grounded. It gave her something to focus on besides herself and how awful she felt. The wind played with the sails, not with her hair. The window was shut, and it was too far away to touch her regardless. It was, as far as she was concerned, an abstraction, an unseen force that blew out the sail of the biggest ship she saw so that it reached its full span. The sails of the smaller ships were triangles, seemingly unaffected by the wind that propelled them, but the wind must have had a hand in it, she decided. She saw no engines on any of the boats to suggest they could move under their own power. She went back on this decision soon after making it, reasoning that she knew very little about engines, especially where they were to be found on ships. Her husband was no engineer either. He liked to tinker with household appliances, with their electrical system and plumbing too, when there was a problem. But if it's bad enough, then you'll call somebody. This was what she had made him promise her when he began tinkering. To this day, it wasn't clear to either of them what exactly bad enough meant. That is, what separated a bad or a really bad problem from the ones which she allowed, if that was the right word for it, him to take on. He had never electrocuted himself, he argued, his pride a little wounded by the accusation he made. He had dropped a wrench on his foot, but nothing had come of that except a dissatisfied grunt. That's what everyone says, and it's true until it happens to them, she protested, and eventually she got him to see her point. There had to be some line he wouldn't cross, a task so demanding that it would give him pause and make him ask for outside help. If they paid extra for an electrician, plumber, or another species of handyman, what of it? She'd rather pay the bill twice over than pay for Gordon's funeral. She admired his usefulness and studied this feeling against what could go wrong with the dangers he faced. Thoughts of his death were far from her mind when he did their home repairs. She invoked them as a potential outcome, not a likely one. The bumps and scrapes he got when fiddling with the bathroom sink and those he got when tending to the chores he left for her weren't worth a hospital visit. Injuries were, in her words, unpleasant and unnecessary, even when they were minor. Here in their hotel, there was practically nothing they needed to do for themselves, not if they didn't want to. There were no faulty wires in their room, and the water worked. The hotel did regular checkups on whatever might go wrong to ensure that nothing in fact did, not too often anyway. The hotel held itself to a certain standard. Though mistakes were in general inevitable, individually they were the result of some oversight or other that could be discovered and corrected as need be. An employee of the hotel had said this yesterday while fixing something. The particulars added nothing to the idea, so Gordon was untroubled by his not knowing them and having to leave them out. He agreed with the employee as much as he did with what his wife said. He was grateful for what the hotel did for them, not put out like a bored retiree without something to do. She was glad they spared her husband the risk of tampering with things he didn't understand. They really were retired, but they were seeing the world and had, if anything, too much to do. Rather than let it grow out into a full beard or shaving it off completely and smoothing it over, Gordon cultivated a field of stubble on his face. This morning he had asked the hotel for a new razor and got it within an hour. They'd done very little since then. The emptiness of their day so far made it seem further in the past than it actually was. Gordon was happy to hear room service knock on their door, and positively elated to hear the razor was complimentary. The man, maybe the one from the day before, put the 5-pack of razors into Gordon's hand as he opened the door. He then asked them if everything was all right, if there was something else that he could do for them. Gordon couldn't take the interest in his voice as anything but genuine, and this, despite the fact that he had asked the question of 3 other guests that morning alone, in different circumstances, and had with them all pulled off the same trick of well-acted hospitality. He was making a living with it, and that, perhaps, though Gordon was aware this was the case, made his act more convincing. This service was this service was what Gordon thought they had really paid for, what was served to them, and how, and for the location too, the view you could take in from the window, and where you could get to from the hotel's entrance. They hadn't gone anywhere in a while, though. Their room was large and well furnished, as was usual for its price range. Right now, they wanted to enjoy it as much as they could, to sleep, and when not sleeping, to lie undisturbed in their beds or chairs, not expecting a situation to arise for which they'd have to get up. See what you can get if you ask nicely, he asked her, in the manner of teaching her something, and at the same time using his success to show her what the lesson was. He started shaving in the bathroom, and then, bored of standing in one place for so long, took up her handheld mirror and went out into their bedroom to look outside. Their room had 2 chairs, one by the desk, which Gordon had expected his wife to use, and a second, where she was sitting, that stood alone at the window. Gordon, still shaving, came over to join her, walking at the slow pace he took on when doing 2 things at once. He dragged the razor across his cheek, the safest place for him to shave in case his hand slipped. As drops of shaving cream fell on the floor, much closer to the carpet and to her than she would have liked them to be, she wished he'd have stayed in the bathroom and not taken his business where it didn't belong. The sky was unmarred by clouds, not because they weren't there, but because Gordon saw them as just as beautiful and as deserving of their place as anything else. And it could have rained, you know. England was like that, so he had to be grateful it hadn't. Joanne, not wanting to voice her disapproval, busied herself with writing about their travels in her journal. She had taken up this hobby recently to improve her memory and recommended Gordon do the same. The point was to train herself to remember as much as she could about what had happened yesterday and the day before that, and also to more accurately take in what was happening today. The two went hand in hand. They were, come to think of it, pretty much the same, because to do the one required you to have done the other. It was impossible to remember what you never knew. One thing she was sure of was what had driven her to take up journaling. Some time ago, it must have been a month, if not more, she and Gordon had been discussing something. He'd asked her a question, and she grew frustrated at having to say she didn't know. She remembered her frustration more clearly than the subject at hand. Then and now, the particulars were completely out of her reach, and weren't important to her besides what they said about the state of her memory. In practice, her journaling meant that she whittled a day down to a paragraph, and a week down to a page or less. These measurements are meant as guidelines for the reader, not restrictions she placed on herself to write so and so much at a time, or to trim a given number of words to fit her entries into a preconceived mold. She wrote when she had something in mind, always at the end of the day. She set time aside for the places they were there to see, and the life they were there to partake in as much as they were able and up to it. She looked up from her writing. The sun shone on the water, not into their room, and made it glitter. In Spain they had left their curtains undrawn and their window unguarded, which had heated their room terribly. There was no danger of that here. The wind had made no sound as it went past their window, but it cooled things nonetheless, and more than England's sun could heat them. They had booked this hotel by the coast for a week, wanting to rest after traveling, by plane and by other means, though never on foot, for distances longer than a walk, from France to Spain to England. Had they biked to the coast from the other end of the city, their journey would have taken them just 5 minutes. It might have been more in traffic, but the sea hadn't been much to look at that day, and attracted few tourists, of whom none were on the road at the same time they were. They walked the length of the shore and back and didn't swim. There was little about the beach that invited them in, but they could have swum if they'd wanted to, good weather or not. The water was placid and warmer than it looked. Without waves, how could it refuse them? That's how she'd said it in her journal, which was nearly all she had to say about it. The sky had been dark, though not rainy, and so it darkened everything that lay under it, the sea, the sand, and her mood. Their so-called European tour was well under way, and they were undecided whether to round it out by visiting Poland and venture into Eastern Europe. They played with the idea, idling, not wanting to commit to it, and knowing that they didn't yet have to. There was plenty to do while they made up their minds. First they'd explore England, and then they'd see what came next. We'll keep pushing on, or we'll get sick of it and go home, Gordon said, to sum up their options. She tried to put a finger on why she felt ill. Her symptoms were unspecific, a feeling of unwellness, that was all. There were no telltale signs like a cough or a runny nose. It was the Spanish sun that got her, she thought. They'd kept to the shade, but it had got to them both. The sunscreen they'd applied before going out had worked to save their skin, but not their hatless heads. If it got worse, she'd tell him, or he'd ask her about it because he'd feel it too. It couldn't be a sunstroke. She would have fainted if it was that. They made sure to bring bottled water, and because the size of the bottles was uniform, she knew they drank their fill. Spain, all of Europe it seemed, was under a heat wave that went through the continent like a rolling storm goes through a town. They had gone in and out of churches, seeking shelter and history, and by coincidence had watched the running of the bulls from the sidelines. She estimated, badly, that some of the townspeople that ran were about their age, which for a moment made her think of joining in, but then she sank back into the passivity that the heat brought. It was easier to stay put. What she saw was less of a spectacle than the name and the idea it gives rise to implies. The bulls moved at a jogging speed, which, compared to a full charge, was like walking through water. They didn't exactly pursue the runners either, not with murderous intent. They took swipes at the stragglers they could reach with their horns by swinging their heads to the side, but they didn't stop to hurt the people they caught any more than that. What got the bulls to move was the commotion all around them, that being ahead and behind, where the runners were, and to their sides, where the audience was. The audience stood at street level or looked down from windows, balconies, and the like. The streets were wide, but nevertheless, each runner stood shoulder to shoulder, or else very close in some similar way, with the many others that were there. The size of the crowd didn't prevent Joanne from finding things that stuck with her, and which later found their way into her journal. These were the way the runner's arms swung back and forth as they chugged along, like the axles of an old train, and also how a man put a hand to the lower end of a bull's back. He was able to do this because he was in the animal's blind spot, where its eyes couldn't reach anyone, no matter how far it might turn its neck. The walls of the houses that filled the street were flat, and there were no staircases that led to their doors over which a runner might trip. Had the man fallen, the bulls would have heard him hit the ground and ignored him, like they did the runners that hugged the walls and spread themselves thin when a bull came close. The runners who had trained for the occasion, or believed they were in such good condition that their clothes should reflect it, wore athletic wear, soccer jerseys, or workout gear. Gordon and Joanne, by contrast, wore the thinnest and most breathable clothes they'd packed, khaki shorts and cotton shirts. They were better off wearing that than they would have been in a runner's clothes, though they felt so hot just watching that they complained to each other about what neither could change, wasting their breath and their water. Gordon spotted as many as 5 men dressed in long pants and 2 with long-sleeved shirts. No dark spots to indicate sweat, nothing to indicate discomfort. But why wear that at all? The Spanish were used to it, he thought. He knew he was judging them by what he would feel if someone signed him up for the run against his will. It made no difference to them how much they wore. They'd find it funny, he supposed. if they knew what a fuss he made about how much he had on. What winter was there to speak of in these parts? It was warm year round. The few degrees that went missing between summer and fall were usually negligible. Visiting a range of climates presented a challenge. Their solution was to pack and to dress in layers. Rather than bring one heavy coat to wear when the weather made it appropriate, they stacked shirts on top of shirts and clothes on top of underclothes. In unbearably hot places such as this, they stripped down to as little clothing as they were comfortable with, taking into account the weather and their sense of what was proper, which went much further than the laws about modesty did. Where Gordon came from, few except for farmers and school children on field trips ever saw a bull up close except after it had been slaughtered and packaged and shipped to a store and sent to a store. He and Joanne were now one of these few, of which there seemed to be more here. The words bull and ox and the breeds of each animal were much the same to him and also to his wife. Before they had bought plane tickets or packed their bags, they'd written up a list of where to go. When Spain came to mind, they thought of bullfighting, which was too grisly for them. It's an acquired taste, she declared diplomatically. Gordon finished her sentence, taking it in a new direction. And I think I'm too old, or too set in my ways anyhow, to get it. You have to grow up with it, probably. Back home, bullfighting was easy to scoff at, and then give no more thought to. Once they'd arrived in Spain, and bullfights were a short drive away, their distaste became more firmly rooted. It was something they'd never seen, and never wished to see. Rather than spoil their appetites and give themselves a shock, they saw the sights and strolled through Madrid, not entirely sure what they'd find, and therefore eager to discover it. During their travels, she had grown accustomed to seeing the unusual, and so she let it pass her by when it didn't suit her mood. When would she next have the chance to see a bullfight? It didn't matter to her. She knew what she would find there without buying a ticket. Call it stubborn prejudice or good judgment, she knew that blood would be spilled and guts thrown about, and it frightened her to think of it much further than that. In these cases, she shook her head and said it was a horrible situation which she wanted no part in. If terrible things had to happen, they should have a happy ending. Barring that, some good should come of it, however much you could get. To watch a fight to the death, you had to disabuse yourself of these notions before you took your seat, which she was unwilling and unable to do. Blood would be spilled whether she sat in the arena or not, and it was happening that very minute as she studied the ships. It was easier to bear because it was out of view and far from her mind, and so it didn't greatly concern her. The sights and sounds of the bull ring, as well as the beige stain of its dust, stopped at its doors. Still, she felt a sudden rush of sympathy for men and bulls everywhere. As she saw it, it only made sense to steer clear of what would upset her. She had nothing to prove and nothing to gain, and if she'd watched a fight, she would have had to pay up for the privilege of having nightmares too. If Gordon had liked bullfighting, that would have complicated things, and if she had liked bullfighting, that would have made them simpler. Neither was the case. Her hypotheticals came up even. Wrapped up in these lofty thoughts about bullfighting and matters tangentially related to it, she imagined how it would be to attend a bullfight. The arena had all the things such a match depended on: stands for the audience, a bull and a matador to entertain them, and a barrier to stop the bull from attacking those it shouldn't. Her daydream began in the middle of the match. The combatants were already going at it. The bull's black hide and the man's face glistened. The audience was shielded from the sun by a canopy, and, being seated, had no way to work up a sweat. The fight had apparently constrained itself to the man and the bull going in circles around the ring. It was the matador who moved the most, who gave the bull a wide berth as he kept his eyes on it, and raised his sword at the slightest warning of a charge. The bull, for its part, shifted towards the matador, matching every step he took, and acting as the center around which he revolved. The man's chest swelled and deflated rapidly as he breathed hard through the dusty air. She left the injuries he should have incurred from the fight to someone else's imagination. The bull's horns were impeccably white, as if touched up specially for the show. The look on the bullfighter's face was blank, such a fine blank slate that she could have found in it a hint of any emotion she chose to look for. He felt anger at the bull and sadness at his having to kill it, a feeling he overcame with determination. Lastly, there was the light, dizzy feeling that came from continually and narrowly escaping death. The bullfighter was a tall man who looked like he could take a hit. The bull put that to the test. What defined the bullfighter in her mind was his outfit. He wore a bandana around his neck, a loose white shirt, green pants, flat shoes, and socks so long that they were better called stockings. Some of it was outdated, based on advertisements and fanciful stories told by people untroubled by accuracy. Some of it no bullfighter had ever worn inside the ring. The man himself had some semblance of reality, and could have existed, though it would be hard to find him. She had seen another sort of bullfighter on TV. He had worn a bright red jacket with thick shoulder pads and pants of the same color. On his jacket and down the length of his arms and legs he'd worn a design in gold, whose significance she had given up wondering about. She had seen him in a documentary on rodeos. As true to life as he was, his whole get-up was laughable to her. She put this man aside as she turned to the next page in her journal and began drawing the man of her daydream and the bull he'd fought. She drew lazily, not caring if she was too slow to finish the picture before she lost interest in it. Gordon liked to watch boxing. She tolerated it and listened to him talk when it came up. He had tried to educate her, an attempt she had allowed him to make, though she admitted from the beginning that she didn't share his interest. "Watch a couple of matches with me, and maybe you'll understand," he said. Thanks to Gordon, she was familiar with the most surface-level rules of boxing, where you were and weren't allowed to hit. Unfortunate accidents, like that of a fighter getting his mouth guard knocked out, taught her about the protections that were in place. A boxing glove that had been badly fastened came loose as a bout went into the later rounds. It flew off the man's hand, and so she saw his hand wraps. The referee stopped the fight, wedging himself between the two men as the first, who'd had the accident, went to retrieve his glove, and the second let his arms fall to his side and rest. Like Gordon when he slowed to a saunter while on one of his twice-a-month runs, the boxers found that picking themselves up and getting back into the fight was harder on them by far than fighting without an ultimately unhelpful 10-second pause would have been. Gordon had never had the physique of any athlete, not the power of a boxer in whatever weight class he might fall into, nor the stamina of someone for whom running was as routine as watching boxing was for him. He may have grown to like playing either sport if he'd given them a try. The fight resumed and became a flurry of punches, slow and fast, thrown with precision or in wild desperation, breaking pauses of varying length in which the boxers moved around the ring, in circles or in a more convenient formation, maneuvering for a better position, for leverage and the upper hand. They maneuvered for a better position, for leverage and the upper hand. It was uncommon for a fighter to move faster than the eye can see, so Joanne's problem was not that their punches became blurs, but that she couldn't think ahead of the obvious, what was happening before her eyes, and consider what hadn't happened yet, but might. She had grasped, or thought she did, how a hook differed from a jab. The first was defined by the direction it came from. The second was defined by its speed. What role they played as one punch in a series of punches eluded her. The violence she saw was pitiable because she had no investment in it. It was as unreal to her on the screen as it would be too real sitting ringside. The roaring crowd would overwhelm her, and she wouldn't have been able to focus on the fight. She drew what she most vividly remembered from the matches Gordon had shown her recently. Shown her. Her, yeah, She drew what she most vividly remembered from the matches Gordon had recently shown her. The mangled look the boxers had after they had beat the blood out of their opponent's face. Unless it jeopardized the fight, neither stopped to wipe their blood or sweat away. Gordon loved to play backseat coach, announcing to her what the fighters should have done after they made a mistake, and praising them for their smart decisions. Something about these fights stirred his blood, whether it was a match between no-names or champions. The fights they'd watched together on vacation were between no-names, unknown to her and surprisingly also to him. The boxers whose names she knew were retired and out of shape. They had made their money, bought houses, and gotten fat and old. If necessary, they found a new niche for themselves to work at when the endorsements dried up. It took bought, bought big houses. When the endorsements dried up, it took quite some time for a boxer's fame to eclipse the limits of their sport and for them to become a household name. The titles they won were meaningless to her, except in regards to the weight classes. She was unsure about these too. How much was a lightweight, how much a heavyweight, and where was the cutoff for middleweights on either end? She suspected, though she had no recollection of asking, that Gordon had told her at least once, if not more than that. She had started her journal too late for her to have written it down. It must have come up while they were watching an older fight. He had been, she guessed, talking away and trying, by showing off his enthusiasm, to light something of the same in her. She was doing her best to make some headway, and believed she was getting it because she repeated the numbers that he tossed at her. The stockier fighter was half a head shorter than his opponent, but it wasn't a mismatch, Gordon said. He looked up the rules and recited them for her. There was no upper limit for heavyweights. Middleweights were 160 pounds or under, and lightweights were 135 pounds or under. After they'd watched the bulls run and then spent the rest of their day walking around the city, they'd gone back to their hotel and found to their dismay that their room was too hot to sleep in. The open window had let in the sun, whose heat wasn't so easily lost when night came. They left the window as it was, hoping the night air would help. Hoping the air would help. If it did, it wasn't much use. Gordon asked her when it would cool off, as if she should know. It must cool off, but when? Did they have to wait until midnight? That's what they did, or tried to do, an experiment they wouldn't have thought of or let themselves conduct if they weren't retired and in Spain. What stood in their way? Tomorrow they could sleep in or get up early, however their bodies decided to take this night out of theirs. They found things to do and to say, and places to be to stay awake. Gordon periodically put a hand to a wall or to the ground, some surface or other, to test their temperature. Stones retained heat better than dirt. The wood and metal of park benches was something else entirely, though the same principle applied. As they sat on a bench, a question came to her. Why did he love boxing so and refuse a bullfight? He answered promptly, thinking one step ahead of what he said, and talking at a speed that matched. It was similar enough to boxing to invite comparison, which robbed it of any discovery it might have held, but it was also too different to be familiar. With boxing, he understood how two men tried to outthink and outlast their opponent. In a bullfight, only the matador had rules to abide by. Only he could make plans. What could a bull think about? It was unrestrained by the inhibitions of human fighters, and, being wilder, had little capacity for forethought. In an injured state, it had virtually none, and its frenzy worsened with every stab the matador made at it, and every wound that his sword opened or deepened. Matador was the word Gordon used for the man in the ring. A picador was no more to him than a foreign word, and the logic of the bullfight was also a mystery. Why did bullfighters attack the spot between the bull's shoulders rather than go at its unprotected flank or neck? How deep did they drive their swords into the bull, and how close to it did they have to stand while doing so? A bullfight was also more brutal than boxing, and had no strategy he could appreciate. The matador's nimble sidesteps and cape flourishes were, like the punches he tried to explain to her, deceptively simple techniques with a hidden complexity. He had no idea what made a matador, and how the ring might, in one moment, give someone more courage than they had naturally outside of it. Than they naturally had outside of it. Nearly every boy, he said, had some memory of play fighting, a game they took to by instinct. Depending on how you looked at it, either that was his introduction to boxing or it had come a bit later, when he was slightly older and his father had shown him a match. He didn't understand how anyone could go from those games to the bull ring. All in all, bullfighting was an inferior sport for what it demanded of the matador and of the bull, and what it gave them and the audience in return. As for the bull run, that was a custom, not a sport you could compete in and measure yourself against others. Had she not sprung the question on him so suddenly, asking him to justify, had she not sprung her question on him so suddenly, asking him to justify how he felt, he wouldn't have said so much, nor found so much to say. He wouldn't have said more than a sentence or two, and given that over to her in explanation. He felt he knew himself better at the end of his monologue, and said he was glad to have come here, and glad to have her, and glad for so much more than that. He gave thanks until he reached the end of his list, trying to name what that was. He took her hand, and they sat there silently until they agreed it was time to go back. That was On the Sidelines, a story written and read by Philip Ballerscheff. Again, if you'd like to read along or just subscribe to my blog, you can find a link to that in the description. And as always, remember to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks, and until next time.